If you grew up in Canada before apps and craft flights, you remember the snacks before you remember the menus. You walked into a smoky room, winter still on your coat, and something was already on the table. A bowl, a basket, a jar in the corner. In this video, we are going to walk through 15 old pub snacks only. True Canadians, remember. Your job is simple. Count how many you can still see in your mind. That is your Canadian pub test. Free salted peanuts were the soundtrack of the old Canadian pub. They arrived without anyone asking. The bartender poured them into glass ashtrays or plastic dishes and slid them across sticky counters. Bars bought them cheap in bulk and turned them into profit with one trick. Salt makes you thirsty. You could tell how long a night had gone on by looking at the shells. They piled up on tables and floors, swept into little drifts under stools. Some people cracked peanuts at high speed. Others split them slowly to make the bowl last. Nobody worried about how many hands had been in there before. In a time when money was tight and beer was the main purchase, a full bowl of peanuts felt like the bar saying, "You belong here." Pickled eggs sat at the other end of the counter and tested your courage. The tall glass jar did not need a sign. It loomed on the back shelf, cloudy with vinegar and spices, eggs stacked in slow, quiet rows. For some regulars, a beer without an egg felt wrong. They knew exactly how they liked it. A shake of salt, a splash of hot sauce, maybe a pickle on the side. Others swore they would never touch one and turned away when the lid came off. The smell was sharp and sour. It cut through smoke and fryer fat in every small bar, from city taverns to country hotels. Newcomers tried one on a dare and coughed as the vinegar hit. Old hands bit them in two, wiped their mouths, and went back to cribbage. Even people who never tasted a single egg remember that jar, watching from the corner of their eye as it slowly emptied over the week. Hawkins Cheesies turned the bar into a corner shop for a few minutes at a time. The bright orange curls never stayed in the bag for long. Staff tore them open and tipped them into small plastic bowls. A ring of cheese dust clung to the rim. The color did the rest. Under yellow lights and TV glare, that orange glow stood out across the room. Hands drifted toward it whenever conversation paused. Fingers came back stained and sticky. People wiped them on paper serviettes already marked with beer rings or straight onto jeans and flannel sleeves. Some bowls arrived fresh and crisp. Others sat a bit too long and softened around the edges. Nobody cared. People were not counting calories or arguing about portion sizes. Cheesies in a pub were not a health choice. They were a small, silly bonus in rooms where most talk was about weather, work, and hockey. Ripple chips in wicker baskets were the quiet regulars. They did not show off, but you missed them if they were not there. The baskets were shallow and light, lined with thin white napkins that sagged under the grease. Most of the time, the chips were plain and ridged, poured from big bags of Old Dutch or whatever brand the bar could get cheap. Their job was simple: sit in the middle of the table and keep everyone's hands busy while the night rolled on. Groups formed and changed around them. Someone sat down, took a sip of beer, reached into the basket without thinking, and joined the conversation. Kids allowed into hotel lounges at lunch remember digging for the biggest chip. Adults remember finding a perfectly folded one at the bottom. By closing time, only crumbs and oily napkin scraps were left. A few dollars worth of potatoes had kept a whole room going for hours. Hickory sticks were the messy ones, and maybe the most addictive. Poured into small bowls, they looked like a pile of matchsticks. Their smoky smell reached you before your hand did. It was part campfire, part salt, and it clung to fingers and sleeves. No one took a single stick. People grabbed pinches without thinking, then went back for more the moment their hand was free. The tiny pieces stuck between your teeth, fell onto shirts, and lined up along the edge of the table. Staff muttered about them while sweeping, plucking strays from every corner, but they kept serving them because they worked. In pubs where money did not stretch to full meals for everyone, one big bag of hickory sticks turned into bowl after bowl. For younger Canadians, they were the taste of sneaking a sip of someone's beer when no one was looking. For older ones, they were the crunch that kept talk going late on nights when the weather outside made going home feel harder than staying put. All of these bowls had the same secret. You did not choose them. They chose you. There were no printed snack menus and no fancy sharing boards. You walked in, hung up your coat, and they appeared as if they had always been waiting on that table. A bowl of peanuts, a dish of cheesies, a basket of chips, a heap of hickory sticks, the jar of eggs watching from the back bar. Together they made the first layer of the old Canadian pub, the part your hands reached for without thinking. Once the bowls were on the table, your eyes moved higher. Old Canadian pubs had a second layer of snacks that stood up on the tables and sat on little plates. These were not just something to grab without looking. They were part of how the room looked and felt. If the bowls were background, these were the small decorations that showed how much pride a place took in looking after its regulars. Pretzel rods were the easiest to spot. Not little twists in a bag, but long, thin sticks standing upright in tall glasses. Most of the time, the glass was the same kind used for highballs, now pressed into snack duty. The rods leaned against each other like a bundle of bread straws. You reached for one without thinking while you listened to someone tell a story from work or watched the third period on the TV. People tapped them on coasters, snapped them in half, or pointed with them across the table when they made a joke. When the glass got low, only broken ends and salt crumbs lay at the bottom. Someone would shake it, laugh at how empty it looked, and slide it to the edge of the table. A fresh glass meant the night was not over yet. Behind the bar, there was usually at least one big jar most customers never saw up close. It sat on a low shelf or in a back corner, filled with a jumble of nuts, pretzels, and odd crunchy shapes that could have come from anywhere. Some bars tipped in leftovers. Others bought cheap mystery mix in bulk. It did not matter. When a table looked bare, the bartender dipped a metal scoop into that jar and emptied it into whatever dish was clean. That is how you ended up with bowls that seemed different every time you visited. One night, you hit the jackpot with extra cashews and cheese cracker shapes. Another night, it was mostly broken pretzels and those strange pale breadstick bits. Nobody complained. It was free, it was salty, and it helped a cheap pint stretch a little further. Out of those jars came the house pub mix, and every place swore theirs was special. In truth, the idea was almost always the same. Take a few things that are cheap and crunchy, mix them together, and hope people keep reaching for more. One bar might combine peanuts, pretzel knots, and tiny orange cheese crackers. Another might stir in corn chips, cereal squares, and curled corn snacks that left powder on your fingers. Some tossed in spicy pieces for surprise. Regulars could tell when the mix changed, even if the owner said nothing. Someone would take one handful, pause, and say, "They got a new batch in." Then they would keep eating anyway. The taste of the pub mix became the taste of that room. Years later, people can walk past a closed-down hotel bar and still talk about their mix, like it was a secret recipe. Not everything came scooped from jars. Some snacks arrived on plates that looked almost fancy by old pub standards. Cheese cubes were the simplest version of that. On busy nights, you might see a row of small plates lined up behind the bar, each covered in neat squares of cheddar or processed cheese with toothpicks already stuck in. Sometimes there was a cocktail onion or baby gherkin on the side if the owner was feeling generous. You grabbed a cube on your way back from the washroom or when you stepped up for another round. One cube turned into 3 without you quite noticing. At the end of the night, the toothpicks lay in little piles, proof that a cheap block of cheese had kept a whole crowd grazing for hours. In prairie towns and some small cities, the cheese plate had a bigger, heavier cousin: kielbasa and rye. Thick slices of garlic sausage, still cool from the fridge, laid out on plain white plates next to pieces of rye bread. Sometimes you got a smear of mustard down one side. Sometimes a few pickles were dropped on top. It was simple, but if you had come straight from work, it hit like a full meal. People built small, open-faced sandwiches at the table, mustard on fingers, crumbs on shirts. Ask anyone from a prairie town about kielbasa in a bar, and watch how fast they start describing their favorite plate. For many, it was the one thing that made their local tavern feel different from a chain. It tasted like home, even if home was still miles down the highway. Then there was the pepperoni and cracker plate, the humble cousin that showed up almost everywhere. Plain soda crackers, the kind you would normally see with soup, laid out with slices of pepperoni stick on top. No garnish, no cheese. Sometimes the plate itself was paper. It did not look like much, but it worked. People stacked 2 slices of pepperoni on one cracker, folded it like a tiny taco, and popped it in their mouth between turns at the dartboard or the pool table. You could eat 5 or 6 without feeling like you had ordered a real meal, which suited people who did not want to admit they were hungry. In some bars, the plate came out with every pitcher. In others, it appeared only for regulars who stayed past the first wave of customers. Either way, it stitched together long evenings, one small bite at a time. Together, these glasses and plates gave each pub its own character. A visitor might remember the beer brand on the tap or the sign above the door. Locals remembered whether their place was a pretzel glass pub, a kielbasa pub, or a pub mix pub. These snacks filled the gap between the free bowls and a proper ordered meal. They made a cheap drink feel more generous, especially on cold nights when people arrived straight from shifts in mills, offices, shops, or on the road. If the bowls and plates kept you going, the last group of snacks tried to be a whole meal. These came out in older hotel bars, legions, and small-town taverns when afternoon quietly turned into evening. You did not order them. You just heard a line from behind the bar, something like, "There is food out if you want it," and people started drifting toward the end of the counter. That was your sign. You were not just staying for a drink anymore. You were staying for the night. In many small towns, that free lunch usually meant sandwich wedges. Nothing fancy. Cold ham or roast beef on plain white bread, cut into triangles and piled onto plates. Sometimes there was mustard. Sometimes mayonnaise. Sometimes just meat and butter. The bread stuck slightly to your fingers and left soft crumbs on the table. You told yourself you would only take one triangle. Then you grabbed another while you talked. By the time you stopped, you realized you had eaten half a plate and were no longer thinking about what to cook when you finally got home. On other days, or in other bars, the plates were heavier. Mini meat pies and sausage rolls appeared, lined in rows on paper napkins or worn china. These were not the neat versions you see in shops today. The pastry was thick. The filling was hot, salty, and tried to fall out the moment you picked one up. Some places sliced full-sized pork pies into small wedges and called that bar snacks. Others cut cocktail sausage rolls in half so they would stretch further. You stood there with pastry flakes on your shirt and a pint in your other hand and knew very well this was your dinner, even if you never said the word out loud. Then there were the little dishes that waited quietly until you needed them. Bowls of cocktail onions and baby dill pickles pulled straight from jars behind the bar. They were wet, sharp, and strong enough to wake you up after a long day. Some people speared them between sips of beer, enjoying how the vinegar cut through the taste of malt and smoke. Others dropped the onions into their glass and made their own cloudy version of a cocktail. If you were a kid allowed into the lounge at lunch, you probably stole a pickle from your parents' plate and felt like you had gotten away with something big. In coastal pubs, especially in fishing towns and along the Atlantic and Pacific edges, the free food could taste like the sea. Smoked mussels or oysters on saltines appeared on small plates, laid out in neat rows. The bartender cracked open a tin, set each piece on a plain cracker, and sometimes added a dash of hot sauce or a squeeze of lemon if one was handy. They looked small and a bit odd to anyone not used to them, but the flavor was huge. Sea salt, smoke, and crunch in one bite. You ate one, then reached for another before you had finished chewing. For people who grew up near the water, that taste still brings back foggy nights, wet boots by the door, and the sound of waves in the distance when the bar finally closed. Put all of these snacks together and a clear pattern appears. Old Canadian pubs did not need long menus or fancy words to keep people fed. They needed 3 simple things. Something salty in a bowl to keep hands busy and glasses refilling, something more filling on a plate to soak up the beer, something sharp or pickled to cut through the taste and wake you up when the room grew warm and heavy. Peanuts, chips, cheesies, and hickory sticks took care of the basic crunch. Pretzel rods, pub mix, cheese cubes, kielbasa and rye, and pepperoni with crackers gave people something to work on slowly. Sandwich wedges, meat pies, sausage rolls, pickles, onions, and smoked mussels turned just one drink into a small meal without anyone ever saying the word supper. Today, most of the snacks themselves have not really vanished. You can still buy peanuts, ripple chips, cheesies, and hickory sticks at the supermarket. You can still put together kielbasa and rye, pepperoni and crackers, or a plate of cheese cubes and pickles at home. What has gone is the way they were served, free on the bar, shared without thinking, sitting in chipped bowls and scuffed baskets that came out night after night. Health rules changed. Insurance changed. The way people drink changed. But the memory of those snacks between full ashtrays and sweating beer glasses is still sharp for anyone who was there. So here's your scorecard. Out of these 15 old pub snacks, how many do you remember seeing with your own eyes? How many did you actually taste? How many do you only know because a parent, grandparent, or older friend told you stories about them? If you recognize at least a few, you can safely say you passed the true Canadian pub test. If you recognize almost all of them, then you probably spent more than a few evenings under low lights, listening to clinking glasses and hockey on the television, while a jar of pickled eggs watched from the bar. If this brought back even one clear picture or one clear taste, tell us which snack was your snack. Was it the free peanuts, the cheesies in the plastic bowl, the kielbasa, rye, or the smoked mussels on saltines? Share your memory in the comments so other Canadians can say, "Yes, I remember that too." That is what this video is really about. Not just the food, but the feeling of belonging to a time, a place, and a country where a few simple snacks on a table could turn a cold night into something warm you still think about all these years later.